Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle. Thank you for coming along. I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Adam Clayton Powell III. Today, we're going to, as we often do, take a look at electricity and the electric supply, the most vital commodity we have coming to the home, to the factory, to the workplace in the times we live in. And to talk about it is a critical player. He is Jim Robb, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. Jim, welcome to the broadcast. And in your words, tell us exactly what NERC, as it is known throughout the industry, what NERC does.
So NERC is a independent nonprofit corporation set up by an act of Congress in the mid-2000s in response to the 2003 Northeast blackout. And we're responsible for all things related to bulk power system reliability. So we set and enforce reliability standards on the high voltage transmission system and power plants that connect to it. We study the system, we analyze events, all of which is meant towards making the industry perform better as the world becomes more complex around it.
Jim, your organization published a report last winter that begins with a summary that we are, quote, on the cusp of large-scale growth, bringing reliability challenges and opportunities to a power grid that was already amid unprecedented change. Future electricity peak demand and energy needs are rising faster than at any time in the past 5 or more years. Industry faces mounting pressures to keep pace with accelerating electricity demand, energy needs, and transmission system adequacy, close quote. That doesn't sound like business as usual.
No, it's not. We are in what I've called in many forums a hyper-complex risk environment. And it was challenging before, just with the transition of the resource mix away from a fossil fuel intensive industry to one that's going to be more powered by renewable energy, wind and solar. It's challenged by the extreme weather that we've been experiencing over the last 10 to 15 years, which shows no sign of abating. It's challenged by a risk environment associated with security, whether that's domestic violent extremists or nation state adversaries and their cyber capabilities. What was new last year was the growth outlook. For the longest period of time, the electric industry in North America hasn't really grown because we've been so good at implementing energy efficiency measures to keep peak load growth very, very modest. But that's changing. It's changing because of reindustrialization of the economy. It's changing because of our use of technology in all of our all the things we hold dear, whether it's Facebook, ChatGPT, Google, all those things are embedding AI into their algorithms. And AI is a very energy intensive use of information technology. And then if you throw on top of that electric vehicles, electric transportation, and building electrification, it's a whole new ballgame for the electric sector for sure.
Jim, to ask you brutally, are we going to have blackouts this summer and next winter?
So we're just in the process of doing our summer seasonal assessment, and it looks better than it did last year. We still have a number of areas of the country that are at risk of what we call elevated risk, at risk of energy shortfalls under extreme conditions. But all of the planning areas in North America are meeting their reliability criteria. So that bodes well, but we are still in a period of elevated risk. As we move into the winter, that's going to become more problematic because one of the things that's helping our summer outlook so much is the fact that a lot of the addition that's coming onto the grid is solar, and in many cases, solar combined with batteries. That's a terrific technology for meeting summer peak loads. But when we get into the winter, we don't have as much sunlight. We're more at risk of gas supply disruption, and we frequently see more volatility in the wind outlook.
In your last winter reliability assessment, there's a striking graphic that has much of the United States from Minnesota all the way down to Louisiana in bright red labeled, quote, high risk and quote, capacity shortfalls. That sounds pretty serious. Are we talking about blackouts?
In those areas, what we characterize as red or high risk, they're at risk of not being able to meet their energy needs under normal conditions, right? And the things that could create an issue there would be if there was a widespread wind drought, particularly in that part of the country, because it's so dependent on wind generation. Um, the rest of the country we show, I think, mostly as orange, which means that under normal conditions, they should be fine. But if we had another widespread cold event like Elliott or Uri, right, we could see some real challenges in that scenario.
When we run short of electricity, is there any quick fix like changing the time of day?
No, unfortunately, it won't make that big of a difference. The issue is that energy infrastructure takes a long time to build, which is why we have to plan for it 5, 10, 15 years into the future. And there's no quick fix. Now, there are resources that can be added to the system fairly quickly, but that's mostly, again, going to be wind and solar, which help a lot under certain conditions, but not under every condition. And that's the challenge that we're running into. It's exacerbated by the fact that we're losing a lot of we call traditional generation, so coal and nuclear generation, older natural gas plants. And those are the resources that can produce electricity very reliably under almost any condition. And that's one of the challenges that we're keenly attuned to and continue to highlight for the government and policymakers is that while it's great to add wind and solar to the grid because they're low carbon resources, they produce a lot of kilowatt hours for this country, they don't produce everything that the grid needs to operate stably. And that's why we're so adamant that we need to keep some of these older resources around because they're just essential for reliability.
Again, turning to your 2023 December assessment, you include for New England, quote, 2024 winter fuel supply risk. What does that mean?
So New England is unique in this country in that it is one of the most energy constrained areas of the grid. They don't have a lot of native resources. They're very constrained in terms of their interconnections to neighboring systems, all of whom also have a number of significant constraints. It's very dependent on natural gas supply. And one thing we've learned is in the winter, natural gas usually, if we have one of these major cold events like a Uri, like an Elliott, we see natural gas production freeze off and we see reductions in natural gas deliveries to customers. Typically, power generation is one of the first customers to be cut off because we desperately want to make sure that local distribution companies that deliver gas to your home continue to have the fuel they need to keep your pilot lights lit. We had a very scary event during the Elliott storm, which was the Christmas Day storm 2 years ago, where there was so much gas production that froze off in the Marcellus and Utica basin. So that's in Pennsylvania and New York, that the pipelines were losing pressure. And Consolidated Edison, which runs the gas distribution for most of New York City, was very, very close to having to start to shut off parts of their natural gas system. If that had happened, that would have been a disaster far greater than what we saw in the 2003 electric blackout. Because once you de-energize, if you will, a natural gas system, you have to manually go out and inspect every burner. So every furnace, every stove needs to be shut off. You repressurize the system. Then you need to go back out and relight the pilot lights and the ancillary equipment. It's a very, very time-consuming process. When we interviewed the folks at Con Ed, they said had that happened, it would have been multiple months before we would have returned the gas distribution system to service, which underscores the importance of natural gas reliability for this country.
What can we do in the short term to bring more generation on without changing the fundamental direction in which we've decided to go, which is renewables?
Well, I think one of the things we need to do is we need to figure out how to keep older forms of generation around. Many of these older units are slated for retirement. Part of that's due to age, part of that's due to market issues, and part of that's due to environmental regulations that are making it very hard for them to continue to operate. So keeping what we have in place for the foreseeable future, I think, is going to be very, very important. The second thing is we absolutely need to continue to figure out how to get new resources onto the system. Now, there's a success story here. Last year, we added over 25 gigawatts of solar to the system, which is one of the reasons why this summer's outlook is better than last summer's outlook. And again, a lot of that comes with batteries. So being able to add more generation onto the grid is very, very important. Retaining what we have is very, very important. The third dimension, which won't get fixed in 5 years, is we need to be able to build transmission, to be able to move power from where we have it in excess to where we have deficits.
Retaining what we have, to use your phrase, can be politically sensitive because you're talking about retaining coal-fired plants. You're talking about retaining plants that are that under certain circumstances, under other circumstances, might have been closed or modernized. How does the politics of this play out?
Politics are usually driven by shorter-term gratification as opposed to longer-term health. I think we all know that. One of the things we can do is to accelerate the development of gas infrastructure and new natural gas generation. That's also quite difficult in today's political climate. But from a carbon perspective, it's far superior to coal and has a number of the same operating characteristics which we like from an electric reliability perspective. So that's one way we could move that along. The other issue is if we could figure out how to really accelerate the development of this new nuclear technology called small modular reactors. Nuclear generation is perfect for the world that we're heading towards in terms of its reliability characteristics and its environmental footprint, at least on the emissions front. But we're probably much more than 5 to 7 years away from having a fleet of small SMRs.
Jim, how do you calculate weather into your predictions?
Weather is absolutely problematic and becoming more so. And one of the things I think we've all come to the conclusion is we can't look in the rearview mirror to predict the weather systems of tomorrow. So we need to kind of continually be monitoring the way the weather is evolving. And two things. One, we need to either figure out how to build for it, which I think is going to be difficult, particularly in a changing climate environment. But we also need to be well practiced in how we're going to react to it when it occurs, so that we can build both resilience in our infrastructure, that's the planning side of the equation, and in our operations, right, which will help us kind of work through a system that we've never seen before, because we're going to continue to see those. And it's very hard to figure out exactly what to plan for, but we can certainly figure out how to manage through it when those events occur. And it's much broader than temperature. One of the issues that we've seen in these weather systems over the last 5 to 6 years, they're what I call broader, deeper, longer. Broader in terms of the portion of the continent that's being impacted by them, deeper in terms of the temperatures that we're seeing, either colder than what we've seen before or hotter than what we've seen before, and longer duration. And that's a really big issue if you're relying on inventoried fuels. For example, last summer, we saw this heat dome that sat over the lower third of North America for almost 3 months. And we saw well over 100-degree temperatures in places like Houston, Texas, which aren't supposed to get that hot. And that was a real, again, testament to the solar that we brought onto the system, because that helped us get through that, the solar and the batteries. But systems like that aren't normal. And we're likely to see more of those in the future. One of the things I think we're sober about for this upcoming summer season.
For the benefit of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio's POTUS channel 124, you're listening to White House Chronicle. I am Llewellyn King, executive producer and host. Co-host Adam Clayton Powell III joins me. Our guest is Jim Robb, President and CEO of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. White House Chronicle airs nationwide on PBS and public educational and government access channels, and worldwide on Voice of America television and radio in English. Subscribe for full episodes of White House Chronicle each week as a podcast on your favorite audio platform. Watch this and previous episodes on the White House Chronicle website, whchronicle.com. For more information on co-host Adam Clayton Powell III's University of Southern California project, visit TrueVote at usc.edu. If you'd like to receive my weekly columns, just email me at llewellynking1@gmail.com. And do remember, Llewellyn has 4 L's.
But let's talk about some of the big drivers of demand, of new demand, artificial intelligence, data centers. In Virginia, Georgia, Arizona, Illinois, Arkansas are now restricting where data centers can be built and how many can be built. And yet we still want to have everything digitized, and we want to have the internet at our disposal when and where we want it. So how do we accommodate some of these conflicting demands?
Yeah, I think this is a real policy dilemma, both for state policymakers in those areas you mentioned, as well as for the federal government. There's no doubt that technology makes our lives richer. And I think there's a lot of reasons, particularly internet-based technology, for wanting that to be supported in the United States, as opposed to places like China or other places that might have a different power supply equation. I think from a national security perspective, it's important for us to keep these kinds of assets in our domain. I think it's challenging though, because these loads that are being projected, and I don't know that the aggregate load is as high as everyone thinks it is. There are probably likely examples of the same data center being shopped in multiple locations to find one that will actually be able to support it. But there's no doubt that these are huge loads coming onto the system, and in aggregate is going to be a real impact on the power supply. The other issue around these loads is that they can be developed very, very quickly. Our appetite is insatiable, and it's now. And that's going to be the challenge for many of these areas, because there's just not going to be power to support all of them that want to interconnect in any particular area. So that's why I think we're seeing shopping going around. I don't have a good number to tell you what the actual incremental load growth is going to be, but it's going to be substantial, and it's definitely going to tax our grid planners and the resource base of the country.
You have standards for reliability. Can you enforce those? Do you dictate them, or do you just suggest them?
No, our standards are absolutely enforceable. They go through a fairly substantial process of development to make sure that they're addressing the risks that need to be developed, and that they give the utilities appropriate flexibility to meet them in ways that are regionally appropriate for them. But we run a very substantial compliance monitoring effort that's largely done through 6 companies around North America we refer to as our regional entities. And then we work through, when we find non-compliances, we do the risk assessment and will, in many cases, levy a fine. That will go to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for approval, but they can be anywhere from a don't do this again, and we're going to watch, to a fairly substantial monetary penalty. We are in a very significant period of time right now where there are so many new risks coming onto the grid that we have a very robust standard development effort right now, because there are things that are in the risk equation now that weren't in it, 5-10 years ago when the core set of standards were developed. So, for example, winterization standards. to deal with these cold weather events. We're working right now on a series of requirements for what we call inverter-based generation. So that's wind and solar that interconnects onto the grid through power electronics. And we need to teach those electronics how to play nicely with the rest of the grid. One of our major focus areas over the next 18 months is going to be to complete those requirements. And then as the security environment continues to evolve, we always need to be evaluating our cyber protections and our physical security protections to make sure that they're continuing to be resilient against the ever-evolving threat landscape.
Some of the largest users of electricity, industrial users, are talking about building their own power plants, Google, Microsoft, others. Do you think that's going to be a big part of the solution, that large companies will actually build their own power supplies?
I think it will play a role in many of these large facility developments. I think they're also likely to find themselves frustrated because one of the issues we have is that the supply chain just can't keep up with the requirements. So if American Electric Power can't get turbines, right, for their system, I don't know how Google's going to do that. Now they might have a little bit more pull in some areas, but I think in general we're going to have to figure out how to get supply chains to ramp up to be contemporary with the demand outlook that we see. And hopefully some of that supply, that equipment can be developed in the United States as opposed to in countries which may or may not be friendly to our interests. But I think, large facilities bringing their own power will be a feature that we're going to have to reckon with. We'll have to think through all of the reliability implications of those kinds of assets at the scale we're talking about for the rest of the grid. And they'll have to be in compliance with a number of the standards that we put in place as well.
You introduced a very interesting subject, which is the supply chain and the shortage of many critical components for bulk power, also for retail power.
Right.
What are we doing about that? And this is an additional problem on top of the political and siting problems that restrict new power coming to market.
Well, this continues to be a very challenging area. And one of the issues you mentioned retail supply. One of the issues we've been very focused on, along with so many of the utilities, have been distribution transformers, which isn't really a NERC issue, but it's a huge issue for the electric grid because they're almost a consumable, right, with the amount of damage that occurs to them through seasonal storms and the like. One of the issues that the industry had were some efficiency requirements that the Department of Energy was pushing onto distribution transformers, which required some exotic materials and would really drive up the cost, limit the supply for a fairly modest change in efficiency. DOE came out with a series of revisions to those requirements, which the utilities have applauded, saying this makes the situation much, much easier for us. The one issue that we can't get around, though, is software. And so much of the equipment that goes on the grid has embedded software in it, whether it's a large transmission transformer, a relay, kind of bread and butter components of building the electric grid. And we need to always be looking for where that software is coming from and making sure that it's quality controlled and that and it doesn't have anything in it that we don't expect it to have. That's going to continue to be, I think, one of the biggest vexations for us is continuing to quality control software and the ability of software to be corrupted by a nation state adversary.
You just said one of the key words that consumers worry about: cost. Is all of this going to result in electricity becoming more expensive?
Absolutely. And I think this, again, is one of the reasons why energy policy is so hard, right? Because policy at all times needs to figure out how to balance three competing factors. One is people need to have access to energy and it needs to be affordable. Second, it needs to be reliable and secure. And third, it needs to have its environmental impact mitigated. And where we get in trouble, I think, as a country, is when we overemphasize one leg of the stool because it's almost always to the detriment of the other two. And, for example, we could build a really cheap electric system, but it probably wouldn't be reliable and would probably, have significant environmental damage. We could build a 100% clean electricity system. It probably wouldn't be affordable with technology we know today, and or it may not be reliable. We could also build an incredibly reliable system, but it probably wouldn't have the environmental impact that we'd like, and it probably wouldn't be affordable either. So we always need to figure out what the right combination of investments and focus on those three dimensions is. And right now, I think affordability is starting to loom very, very large as people are starting to get their heads around the amount of new capital that's going to need to go into the system. In today's interest rate environment, the cost of that capital is very, very high, and it's all going to put significant pressure on rates.
Jim, how important is consumer behavior to you? We've had a couple of examples where California and Texas have both asked consumers to cut back on their electricity use at times of stress, and it's been quite effective. But people get tired of doing that. But how much of a tool is consumer restraint?
I think consumer response has proven to be an incredibly valuable tool for the reasons you just suggested. I don't think it's what we should plan the grid around, because I don't think my personal opinion is I don't think that's the right construct. But I do think when we find ourselves in energy emergencies like we've had in Texas, like we had in California, that Labor Day heat wave a couple years ago, being able to put out the message from the governor saying, please change your air conditioning setting now, and have so many people make that adjustment is spectacular. That is a spectacular way to rebalance a system when it's under significant stress. In our reliability assessments, we typically will give credit to what we would call structural demand response. So for people who have signed up for interruptible programs and will get paid for not consuming power when the system is stressed or when a conservation call is made, I think that's fair game. I think we can treat that as a resource. But I think when you're relying on the voluntary behavior of millions of individuals, that's not a formula for designing a system on, but it's a very, very good way to avoid a rolling blackout, which would be, indiscriminate and would create real penalties for people.
That is our show for today. Our guest was Jim Rolfe, President and CEO of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And of course, we were joined by Adam Clayton Powell III, co-host of this program. I'm glad the lights are on. I'm glad they may stay on, at least I hope so. I use a lot of electricity making these programs. Cheers.